Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. June 18th, 1977 was a blazing hot Alabama day, with the temperature rising to over 100 degrees, and more than 600 people crowded into the chapel inside the House of Hutchinson Funeral Home in Alexander City. They were all gathered to mourn the loss of 16-year-old Shirley Ann Ellington, who only a week before had been found crushed under the left wheel of her Ford Torino. After the service came to an end, mourners were walking up to view the casket before they left the sweltering hot chapel. Out of nowhere, a young woman in one of the front pews shouted, "You killed my sister, and you're going to pay for it." Seconds later, a man in a green suit, who had been sitting next to the woman during the funeral, jumped up on a pew and pulled a .25 caliber pistol out of his pocket and shot it 3 times. All 3 bullets struck their intended target, Reverend Willie Jr. Maxwell. He was Shirley's stepfather. He was also her killer. Reverend Maxwell fell backward into the red velvet pew, still clutching his white handkerchief. And just like that, the man responsible for terrorizing a small black community for years was dead. Welcome to episode 152, The Serial Killer and Reverend Willie Maxwell. Somehow, it was hotter then. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. That was one of the opening sections in Chapter 1 of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and it's one of my favorites. It puts your mind in a certain place where you can feel the oppressive heat of an Alabama summer. Lee would never write a second novel, though she would always tell the press she was working on one, until she decided to stop giving interviews. It's hard to blame her. Her first book, Mockingbird, is considered a once-in-a-generation achievement. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 1961, the year after it was published, and this December will be the 60th anniversary of the Oscar-winning film based on the book. But Lee did work on a book for many years, a true crime novel, somewhat similar to her friend Truman Capote's work in Cold Blood. However, she was very mindful of the criticisms leveled at Capote's work, now considered a masterpiece, the standard by which modern narrative true crime novels are written. But at the time, there was criticism, and since Nell, the name Harper Lee actually went by, was Truman's research assistant, she saw how he played a bit fast and loose with some facts. But maybe even more importantly, she saw how the book affected the victim's surviving family. So she set strict standards for herself when she set about writing the nonfiction novel she planned to title The Reverend. In an interview, author Casey Sepp, who wrote Furious Hours about Harper Lee and this case, said there were rumors that she did finish a manuscript, but either never published it or it was turned down by a publisher. We will never know the truth because the Lee family had Nell's estate sealed. Since one publisher famously said they probably would have published Lee's grocery list if she gave it to them, I think it's more likely she chose not to herself. She had also chosen to hold on to Go Set a Watchman, which was controversially released just after her sister, who was her lawyer and protector, died. Many believe Harper Lee was not competent to consent to publish Watchman, which was supposedly found by the lawyer who worked for her sister just after her death. The timing was very convenient. Not even 3 months after Harper Lee's sister died, Go Set a Watchman was released. By that time, Ms. Lee was in an assisted living home with a guard at her door who had a list of people who were allowed to see her, which of course would include her lawyer, even if it was a new lawyer who had just taken over for her sister. Lee was confined to a wheelchair, almost completely blind and deaf. In this vulnerable state, you can see why the family took precautions. But some people say at this point in her life, she would sign anything for people she trusted. And now Harper Lee died just 7 months later. As Casey Sepp also wrote about, Go Set a Watchman was actually an early manuscript of Mockingbird. Lee's editor kept sending her back to the drawing board with it, and eventually, the genius of setting To Kill a Mockingbird through a child's eyes was what made the novel so special. And it's how she finally got the direction she needed to complete her masterpiece. I am firmly in the camp that I do not believe Go Set a Watchman should have been published. If Lee had wanted to publish it, she certainly would have, especially considering the pressure she was under to write another book. In case you wonder why I am so passionate about this, To Kill a Mockingbird is my favorite book, and the movie was my father's favorite movie. I'm old enough to remember a time before VCRs, much less DVDs or DVRs. When To Kill a Mockingbird came on television, it was a huge event in our house. We sat down as a family to watch it, and I remember being awestruck seeing my daddy wipe away tears. I understand now. He lost his own father when he was 8 years old, and I lost him when I was 16. Even now when I watch the movie, I ache a little when I see Atticus cuddling Scout in his lap. But anyway, I went on that tangent to explain my love for Harper Lee's work, but also my respect for her ethics. The Reverend Willie Maxwell case was during the height of what is often called the golden age of serial killers. That would be a big part of what she grappled with, a new concept. She was a woman famous for writing a groundbreaking book about racism in the justice system. And now she was going to write about a black serial killer, a man who struck fear in the heart of his small community, a man who kept getting away with his crimes. There are so many possible reasons why Harper Lee chose not to publish, or may have even been stymied during the writing of this book. She was certainly a gifted fiction writer, and the structure of a true crime novel may have felt alien to her, no matter how much it interested her. I, for one, would much rather have read The Reverend than Go Set a Watchman. I think Harper Lee would have written an excellent true crime novel. Truman Capote always praised her research, her eye for details, and the way she could fit in and make people feel comfortable with her. It would have been so interesting to read this story through her eyes. Located in the heart of central Alabama sits Coosa County, a rural farming area. With a total population of around 10,000 people, the county is made up of multiple small towns, including Alexander City, Nicksburg, and Goodwater, the town with the largest population, which is less than 1,300 people. On May 31, 1925, Willie Jr. Maxwell was born in Kellyton, one of the small Coosa County towns. Not much is known about Maxwell's childhood, but Casey Sepp, author of Furious Hours, was able to find out a few things. He was one of 9 children. His parents, Ada, a housekeeper, and Will, a sharecropper, raised their children in the Coosa County community of Crewsville. As was often the case back then, Maxwell quit school at a young age so he could help work on the farm. He ended up completing 7 years of formal schooling. In the summer of 1943, Maxwell, now 18 years old, registered for the draft and was sent to Fort Benning for Army basic training, after which he joined the Engineer Aviation Battalion at Keesler Field in Mississippi. Maxwell served as a sergeant in World War II and was discharged in November 1945. But Maxwell didn't leave the military. Instead, on November 20th, he re-enlisted. He was then sent to California, where he joined the 811th Engineer Aviation Battalion. In January 1947, Maxwell was voluntarily discharged, and then he went back to Alabama. There, according to Casey Sepp, Willie Maxwell was known for being a handsome young man with elegant, almost formal speech. He was charming to everyone he met. People around town recalled, "There wouldn't be anybody nicer to you, conversation-wise. You'd think that man came from heaven, he was so smooth." Maxwell started working at Russell Manufacturing, Alexander City's largest textile mill. He also met the woman that would become his first wife. Mary Lou Edwards was born on July 17, 1927 in Coosa County. When Willie Maxwell started coming around, Mary Lou was living with her parents, Artis and Laura, while working as a laundress and seamstress. On April 2, 1949, Mary Lou and Willie tied the knot, later settling in Nicksburg, a tiny, predominantly black community located 13 miles southwest of Alexander City. In 1962, Willie was ordained as a minister at the Philippi Baptist Church in Keno. According to Casey Sepp, Reverend Maxwell's parishioners, quote, admired his thorough grasp of Scripture. One said, he could say a prayer that could make this house move. Because of his charm and knowledge of the Bible, Reverend Maxwell quickly became well known and respected around the state of Alabama. He started taking seminary classes at a branch of Selma University, and in 1970, 8 years after he was ordained, he was awarded a certificate of theological study from the university. That same year, tragedy would strike Maxwell for the first of at least 5 times. Just before 6 p.m. on August 3rd, the Reverend left the Nicksburg house he shared with Mary Lou and traveled 50 miles to preach at a revival near Auburn. With her husband out of the house for the evening, 43-year-old Mary Lou went to visit her sister Lena. When she got back home, she chatted with her neighbor, Dorcas Anderson. Mary Lou told Dorcas that Willie was at a revival, but before he left, he had made a request. He asked Mary Lou to keep the phone on the hook so he could call on his way home. She thought the request was odd, but she did what he asked. A few minutes later, the conversation between the neighbors ended, and Mary Lou went inside her house to wait for her husband's call. Because revivals were notorious for lasting hours, Mary Lou had no idea when Willie would be on his way home. After 10 p.m., Mary Lou went back over to Dorcas's house. According to Casey Sepp, Mary was, quote, excited and agitated as she told Dorcas, "The Reverend has been in a bad accident and I'm going to get him." Mary Lou then left to go find her husband. She never returned home. At some point after 2 a.m., Reverend Maxwell called the police from his Nicksburg home. He needed to report his wife missing. Investigators went to the Maxwell home and spoke with the Reverend, who told them that on his way back from the revival, he stopped at a service station in Camp Hill to buy a Coke and call his wife, but she didn't answer. When he got home just before 11 p.m., Mary Lou wasn't there. Since he was exhausted from a long day, he didn't go out looking for her. Instead, he went to sleep. About 3 hours later, he woke up and realized Mary Lou still wasn't home. He called her mother and sister, who she had planned to visit, and even his neighbor Dorcas, but no one had seen her, so that's when he called the police. After speaking with Maxwell, investigators spoke with Dorcas, who told them about her 2 conversations with Mary Lou. The one where Mary Lou said her husband asked her to keep the phone on the hook, and the one where she said he had called and told her he had been in an accident. Dorcas told investigators that Willie Maxwell had not been home before he called her, which was at around 2 a.m. And because he had told Mary Lou he had been in an accident, Dorcas decided to go take a look at his vehicle. There was no damage. She told her husband something was wrong because his car wasn't torn up. Investigators went back to the good Reverend, who said Dorcas must be mistaken. He never called Mary Lou about an accident. Like he said earlier, when he called from the service station, she didn't answer. Maxwell then told investigators he had a feeling that it was actually Mary Lou who had been in an accident. He said officers should look for her car on Highway 22, a remote 2-lane road she would have taken to get home from her sister Lena's. Investigators took his advice and started searching Highway 22. It didn't take long before they found Mary Lou's car. It was in a ditch next to some trees, but it hadn't struck any of the trees. Instead, it looked like the car had been parked there. The engine was running and the headlights were on. The car had suffered minimal damage, yet Mary Lou herself was found dead on the passenger side. And she had not suffered minimal damage. There was blood everywhere. Her bruised body was drenched, and there was blood all over the inside of the car. According to Casey Sepp, there was blood on the outside of the car too, on the passenger door, the windshield, and the rear window. Mary Lou's face and head were covered in lacerations. Her jawbone was chipped, her nose was dislocated, and she was missing part of her left ear, which was found on the floor of the back seat. Later, during her autopsy, it was determined that she had defensive wounds and a half-inch bruise along with ligature marks around her neck. Sand and leaves were found in her mouth, as well as in the bloodstains on her dress. Someone had tried to strangle Mary Lou, most likely with a rope, but it didn't work. She fought hard for her life, eventually being brought to the ground, where she was beaten to death. This was no car accident. It was a murder. At a nearby church, they found drops of Mary Lou's blood in the driveway and sand. Based partially on Dorcas's statement, authorities felt like they had enough evidence to arrest Willie Maxwell for Mary Lou's murder on August 10th. Dorcas testified before a grand jury, and the Reverend was charged with first-degree murder on August 15th. Not long after, the charge was dropped for numerous reasons. Casey Sepp wrote that the Maxwell case was particularly easy to dismiss, in both senses, because the judicial system at the time was not especially interested in domestic violence or black-on-black crime. But police investigators were not so quick to give up. They continued collecting evidence against Maxwell, hoping to charge him again in the future. In January 1971, a grand jury was held again, but they refused to indict Maxwell. Authorities continued to build their case against him. Meanwhile, Willie Maxwell and his attorney, Tom Radney, notified 3 life insurance companies of Mary Lou's death. According to Casey Sepp, shortly before Mary Lou was found dead, Maxwell had purchased a $15,000 policy for only 25 cents. He had gotten the policy so soon before that he had never had to pay the $12 required to renew it. The insurance companies refused to pay Maxwell, stating that Mary Lou's death had not been an accident. Radney filed complaints, and one of the companies, Fidelity, was taken to trial in July 1971. The jury awarded Maxwell with the full amount. 3 weeks later, in August, Reverend Willie Maxwell was indicted on first-degree murder charges, and soon after, he went on trial. The whole shebang did not even last a day. Dorcas Anderson, the neighbor who told investigators that on the night of Mary Lou's death, Maxwell had called to say he had been in a car accident, was supposed to testify for the prosecution. That never happened, because between the grand jury hearing and the trial, Dorcas's husband, Abram, had unexpectedly passed away in May, leaving her a widow. And now, she was in a relationship with the Reverend himself. And her statement had drastically changed. When she took the stand, she testified that she couldn't remember a single thing she had told authorities prior to her current testimony. Dorcas told the jury that the Reverend couldn't have been the one who met his wife on that dark highway, because he had not been anywhere near the scene of her brutal murder. The jury acquitted Willie Maxwell due to a lack of evidence. Following his acquittal, Reverend Maxwell and Tom Radney continued going after the other insurance companies who had refused to pay. The companies were still claiming that Mary Lou's death had not been an accident, regardless of what the jury said. But whenever Maxwell and Radney took the companies to court, the jury would side with Maxwell. By October 1971, Maxwell and Radney had collected on all but 3 policies. The company in charge of all 3 policies was refusing to pay because Maxwell had purchased the policies just a few days before Mary Lou was murdered. Maxwell and Radney wanted to take the company to court, like they had done with the others, but before they could, the company caved and paid Willie Maxwell. In total, he made $100,000, more than $700,000 in today's money, off of Mary Lou's death. And in November, the Reverend married his 27-year-old neighbor Dorcas, the woman who was supposedly Mary Lou's friend. They would later welcome a son. By this time, rumors were swirling around town that Willie Maxwell had killed Dorcas's husband Abram. There were also rumors that he was involved in voodoo. An unnamed attorney later told the Associated Press that Nicksburg residents feared Reverend Maxwell because he had been to Mississippi to get voodoo knowledge from the Seven Sisters. The Seven Sisters were powerful hoodoo women who had operated in New Orleans in the 1920s. Although many people have theories on whether or not the women were actually sisters, or even if it was just one woman who wore disguises, the legend lives on today, at least in the form of an internet store that sells voodoo oils. According to the Atlanta Constitution, the rumor around town was that Maxwell would sometimes flaunt a wooden clothespin in an earlobe as proof of his powers. He practiced black magic in a small room of his brick home. He put curses on his enemies and always wore a bulletproof vest. On February 6, 1972, tragedy struck the Maxwell family again when the Reverend's older brother, John Columbus, was found dead 3 miles north of Nicksburg in the intersection where Highway 22 meets Highway 9. John's death confounded investigators. They couldn't figure out how he got out there or how he died. He had not been hit by a car, and there were no visible injuries on his body. A toxicology test was conducted. Results showed that when he died, John's blood alcohol level was 0.41, a potentially lethal amount. After, due to the number of suspicious deaths that would come to surround Willie Maxwell, investigators questioned how John Columbus came to have such a high blood alcohol level. It seemed likely he had been forced to consume an abundance of alcohol. But in 1972, investigators didn't have that much to go on, so his cause of death was ruled as over-intoxication and exposure due to the cold. Willie Maxwell filed a claim with the life insurance company he had used to take out a policy on John. Although he just struck big with his brother's death, Willie Maxwell didn't wait too long to commit his next murder. On the night of September 20th, 1972, motorists traveling down Highway 9 found a vehicle 30 feet from the road. The car and headlights were still on. The lower half of the windshield was cracked, but other than that, it looked like it was just a fender bender. Yet, when the motorists looked inside the car, they found a woman laid out across the floor of the front seat, face down, her head on the passenger side, her feet on the driver's side. Investigators arrived on the scene and immediately recognized the woman inside the car. It was 29-year-old Dorcas Anderson Maxwell, the woman who foiled their attempt to convict the Reverend of murdering his first wife. Investigators were determined to get Maxwell this time. They went over the crime scene with a fine-tooth comb, carefully collecting evidence and taking pictures at every angle. When investigators spoke with the Reverend about why Dorcas had been out so late, He told them that after Dorcas made dinner for the family, she put the children to bed. At around 9 p.m., she drove to Alexander City to see her mother, who had gone fishing earlier that day. Dorcas supposedly told her husband that she wouldn't be gone long. She just wanted to get some of the fish. He stayed home with the kids. It looked like Dorcas had almost made it back home from her mother's. She was only about 250 yards away when her car left the road. Investigators did not believe the Reverend's story, but just like with John Columbus, they were baffled by Dorcas's cause of death. Casey Sepp wrote, "The autopsy was more notable for what the coroner did not find than for what he did. There were leaves stuck in Dorcas's sandals, and she had a few small abrasions on her shoulders and elbows, plus a larger cut above her right eye. Her organs were unremarkable, and toxicology tests showed absolutely nothing in her system. The only overtly suspicious thing was that Dorcas had a fractured hyoid. Nowadays, we all know that a broken hyoid bone can be a sign of strangulation, but back then it was not unheard of for the hyoid bone to be actually damaged during autopsies. For this reason, authorities didn't feel comfortable ruling her death as strangulation. Instead, they ruled that the 29-year-old, perfectly healthy Dorcas died of acute asthmatic bronchitis, even though she was not known to suffer from asthma. Willie Maxwell filed claims on all 4 of Dorcas's life insurance policies, but the companies refused to pay out due to the suspicious circumstances. He and his lawyer, Tom Radney, then sued the companies, stating that Dorcas died from shock after wrecking her car. The company's defense for the lawsuit was that Maxwell had defrauded them by purchasing the policies, then arranging for Dorcas Maxwell to be found dead in an automobile. They also claimed Dorcas's name on the insurance application was either forged or she was induced to sign by false pretenses. The companies accused Willie Maxwell of doing the exact same thing to Mary Lou and John and noted that Maxwell had policies on a number of other relatives. In June 1973, the insurance companies agreed to pay 40% of each policy, totaling $32,800, nearly $215,000 in today's money. In November 1974, the Reverend Willie Maxwell married his 3rd wife, Ophelia Burns. And just guess who that was? Ophelia allegedly was Willie's side piece and accomplice to the murder of his first wife, Mary Lou. Ophelia had actually been charged with Mary Lou's murder right alongside Maxwell, but she never went to trial because Maxwell had been acquitted. Investigators believed she was with Maxwell when he ambushed Mary Lou at the church, or at the very least, Ophelia helped Maxwell move his and/or Mary Lou's car. On February 14, 1976, tragedy struck yet again for the Maxwell family, for the 4th time, when the Reverend's 22-year-old nephew, James Hicks, was reported missing by relatives. James was the son of May, Willie's older sister. At one time, James had worked for his uncle as a pulp wooder, but at the time of his disappearance, he worked at Russell Mills. On February 16th, James's 1968 Pontiac Firebird was found in a ravine on Highway 9 North, near Nicksburg. The car had been concealed by bushes. Inside the car was Willie Maxwell's nephew, James, his lifeless body sitting up in the driver's seat. In the back seat, investigators found paperwork for a life insurance policy. They noticed that James had purchased the policy, listing his mother as the beneficiary shortly before his murder. But when investigators looked more closely, the handwriting on the application was not James's. It was Willie Maxwell's. Investigators found that James was not drunk, he was not high, and he wasn't even speeding. They knew they had found another victim of the Reverend. There was quite a bit of evidence to suggest they were correct. The car looked like it had been parked, and the nearby bushes in the ravine were completely undamaged. James's body also showed no visible injuries. Casey Sepp wrote, He had a few small cuts on his legs and arms, across his chest, and on the inside of his lower lip. He had some caffeine and a little alcohol in his system, but no drugs of any other kind. In the autopsy report, the medical examiner concluded that there was nothing which would adequately account for the death of this subject. His cause of death was ruled as natural causes. Once again, authorities were completely baffled by how a healthy relative of Willie Maxwell ended up dead. Cleared of yet another murder, the Reverend tried to gain control of his nephew's insurance policy by having his sister, James's mother May, grant him power of attorney, but she refused. Less than 4 months later, another family member of the Reverend's would be found dead. Shirley Ann Ellington, known as Shell, was born on November 28, 1960 in Alabama. When she was a young girl, she went to live with Ophelia Burns, a relative who adopted her. Her birth mother, Josephine, lived in nearby Alexander City. After Ophelia married Reverend Maxwell, the three of them lived together in Nicksburg. That would make the Reverend Shirley's stepfather. According to the Reverend, Shirley was a nice girl who loved sports. She attended Coosa County High School, where she was a popular sophomore, always receiving calls from friends. Toward the beginning of June 1977, Shirley started working at a fast food shop in Perryville. Because her sister's house was so close to her new job, she stayed there for the majority of her first week. On June 9th, 16-year-old Shirley finished her first week of work, then went back to the Maxwell home in Nicksburg. In the late evening hours of June 11th, Maxwell arrived home to find that Shirley had taken Ophelia's car and left at around 8 p.m. Ophelia was worried because Shirley hadn't returned. Reverend Maxwell later told an officer he thought Shirley had plans that evening, saying she had gotten a call earlier from some of her friends. The Maxwells drove to Shirley's sister's house in Perryville, but she wasn't there. So at around midnight, the Maxwells and Shirley's sister went to the Alexander City Police Department to see if anyone had found Shirley or the car, a 1974 Ford Torino. The Reverend told officers that Shirley didn't have her driver's license yet. She was still learning how to drive, but she was already a pretty good driver for a beginner, who didn't have any doubts about herself being able to do anything. An officer informed them that someone had found a Torino at 11:45 p.m. out on Old Nicksburg Road, near the Ray community, located around 7 miles west of Alexander City. The officer suggested the Reverend, Ophelia, and Shirley's sister all head out there to see if they can make an identification. Maxwell later told the media that when he arrived on the scene, state troopers would not let him get out of the car because, quote, it didn't concern him. However, they let Ophelia and Shirley's sister approach in order to identify Shirley. The Reverend said he was disturbed by the troopers telling him to stay in the car. He should have been with Ophelia when she ended up making a positive identification. Shirley had been found face up under the left front wheel of the Torino. The deflated tire was off the rim and laying near the car next to a good tire. The jack used to raise the car had not been used with its base. It looked as if she had been trying to change the tire when the car fell, crushing her to death. Investigators told the media that the death appeared to be an accident, but secretly, they weren't so sure. Knowing Willie Maxwell's reputation, Shirley had most likely been murdered. Within days of Shirley's death, Reverend Maxwell spoke with numerous newspapers, including the Montgomery Advertiser and the Alabama Journal. The Advertiser asked him about the suspicious deaths of Shirley and the 4 other family members. This is possibly the first instance of a newspaper reporting information about all of the suspicious deaths. Maxwell told the publication, quote, I have prayed and thought about it a lot, and several thoughts have crossed my mind. He said one thought was that not all the deaths were accidental. It looked like there's some enemy or another sticking around to hinder me, slipping around somewhere. I haven't seen him, but I'm asking the Lord to see, and he will see. and if I stick close to the Lord, I'll see it too. When it came to the first tragedy, the death of his first wife, Mary Lou, the Reverend did not feel like it was an accident. He told the advertiser, quote, "I believe my first wife was honestly killed at the hands of somebody. I think they were waiting for me, and when they saw the car, they thought it was me. But when they stopped her, they found it wasn't me, and they decided to take her instead." He added, "I believe if God was to speak to you or me, we would know who did this to her." As for his brother John Columbus's death, Maxwell didn't think foul play was involved. He told the advertiser, quote, "They said someone had to have held a gun to his head to make him drink that much whiskey. But I knew my brother, and he did it to himself. No one held a gun to his head." He added, "He was a nice guy. He was even nice when he was drinking." Maxwell thought his second wife, Dorcas, died as a result of the car accident, not shock, like he had told the life insurance company. When it came to his nephew James's death, Maxwell hinted that someone could have driven the car into the ravine. During an interview with the Alabama Journal, Reverend Maxwell said he thought Shirley's death was an accident, but he, quote, "has no firm conclusions since he did not get to see her body at the scene." He did say that Shirley, quote, "liked to be on the go and didn't like to be hindered when she wanted to go somewhere." He added, "If she was halted on it, she went anyway." He detailed a few times he had told Shirley she couldn't go somewhere because Ophelia wouldn't give her permission. He said, "Sometimes I had to let her know she couldn't go." When the Alabama Journal asked him about rumors of voodoo, Reverend Maxwell said, quote, "I've heard that. It's not anything true. I didn't want it said. They said the same things about Christ, but I'm not as good as he is." On June 18th, 2 days after the details of the interviews were published, Shirley's funeral was held at the House of Hutchinson Funeral Home with an attendance of more than 600 mourners. As the service came to an end, mourners went up to Shirley's casket to pay their respects before exiting the chapel. When there were around 265 people left inside, many folding chairs in the aisles, Shirley's sister Lavinia went up to the casket. When she saw that Shirley did not look like she had when she was alive, Lavinia started crying. She looked over at Willie Maxwell, who was not crying. Lavinia said she lost it at that moment. She pointed to him and shouted at the Reverend, "You killed my sister, and you're going to pay for it." Seconds later, as Lavinia was being led away, a man in a green suit jumped up in the pew in front of Maxwell and shouted, "You gonna die." The man then pulled a .25 caliber pistol out of his pocket and shot 52-year-old Willie Jr. Maxwell 3 times in the face. Maxwell fell backward into the red velvet pew, still clutching his white handkerchief. His wife, Ophelia, had been standing right next to him. The shooter in the green suit was 36-year-old Robert Louis Burns, Shirley's biological uncle. He was Ophelia's ex-husband's brother. Robert, a truck driver and veteran, was arrested at the chapel and placed in a squad car. According to Alexander City Police Officer James Ware, Robert's brother approached Robert and asked why he had shot Maxwell. Robert responded, "I had to do it, and if I had to do it over, I'd do it again." Officer Ware later reported the conversation he had overheard between the brothers. The problem was, Robert Ware's brother was also a police officer. Robert was transported to the Alexander City Police Station and charged with first-degree murder, to which he later pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Robert was represented by none other than Tom Radney, Willie Maxwell's longtime attorney. When the media asked District Attorney Tom Young to comment on how the Reverend's checkered past may have led to his death, Young stated, "This is a plain case of murder in a funeral home, and that's the way I'm going to try it." When asked about the voodoo rumors, Young said, "All that stuff was based on natural superstition, surmise, conjecture, and reckless gossip. Maxwell was always a gentleman around me. The bank said he paid his debts and had excellent credit. Maybe that's why some people talked about him. That's a poor county, you know." Tom Young seemed to be the only person upset over the Reverend's death. At this point in Willie Maxwell's life, pretty much everyone around town knew his reputation, and they stayed clear of him. Well, at least the black people did. The Atlanta Constitution reported, "The black community walked in living fear of Maxwell, while whites thought him gentlemanly and a good credit risk." The Montgomery Advertiser reported, "His neighbors would not talk about him. One even said not to go near him, and workers at a nearby plant refused to discuss him. Even the manager of the general store near his home did not talk about him, and he was a regular customer at the store." The truth was that locals were relieved after Willie Maxwell was killed. The Coosa County chief deputy said, "We know that they were scared. He was practicing that voodoo stuff, and a lot of them believed in it." For this reason, Robert Burns was an instant hero. An unnamed lawyer told the Atlanta Constitution, quote, 600 people saw him pull that trigger, and I'm betting he walks free." Even before Robert killed Willie Maxwell, there was a lot of talk around town that Shirley had been the Reverend's fifth and final victim. On June 21st, authorities confirmed this rumor as being true. They announced that an autopsy showed Shirley was dead before the car crushed her. She had been strangled or suffocated. A captain in the Alabama Bureau of Investigation told the media, "There's no question in my mind that that car was not the cause of death." And the Coosa County chief deputy agreed, adding sarcastically, "You just don't change a tire like that." There was further proof that Shirley had not been crushed by the car. No fingerprints were found on the car, tire, or lug wrench. And Shirley's hands were clean, meaning she had not touched the tire before her death. Authorities did not name a suspect in Shirley's murder. However, they pointedly said they didn't foresee any arrests being made. The next day, June 22nd, Reverend Willie Jr. Maxwell's funeral was held at the Peace and Goodwill Baptist Church, where he once worshipped. More than 400 people were in attendance. Many were there just to see what would happen. Reverend C. Martis gave the eulogy, telling the crowd that Maxwell had been granted eternal life and would be coming back to help people. According to the Birmingham Post-Herald, Martis also, quote, alluded to Moses in his service, saying the biblical character was a murderer, but God used that murderer. Martis said, "He made mistakes, just like you, but the devil couldn't take Reverend Willie Maxwell from God. The satanic power that's covering this earth cannot take away this eternal life." Martis closed the eulogy with, "Wipe your tears away, family, wipe those tears away, and them who are gossiping, shut your mouth." After the service ended, Martis compared Willie Maxwell to Jesus Christ, telling those who would listen that they accused him of being Beelzebub, saying he cast out spirits with spirits. On September 26, 1977, opening statements began in Robert Burns's trial after an all-white jury of all men was selected. The courtroom was crowded with spectators. Those who couldn't find a seat stood outside the doors, hoping to hear what was going on inside. There was someone else sitting quietly in the courtroom observing, Harper Lee. When the judge banned all recording devices, she later approached the court reporter and told her she would pay for her own copy of the trial transcripts. The prosecution told the jury that Robert planned the cold-blooded murder. He was nothing but, quote, a one-man lynch mob. The prosecution was fighting an uphill battle. Not only was the defendant a local hero, prior to the trial, the prosecution had failed to get the judge to admit Alexander City police officer James Ware's statement about how Robert told his brother he had to shoot Maxwell, and if he had to do it all over again, he'd still shoot him. The problem was that Robert had not been Mirandized before his brother, a police officer, asked him why he did it. So even if Robert did make the statement in the presence of Officer Ware, it wasn't admissible because Robert had not been read his rights. District Attorney Tom Young would not take no for an answer, and on numerous occasions throughout the trial tried to get the judge to admit the statement, which naturally was very frustrating to Tom Radney, Robert's defense attorney. According to Casey Sepp, defense attorney Tom Radney had two goals for the trial: make sure the jury knew that Robert was a war veteran, and make the jury think the voodoo rumors about Willie Maxwell were true. To make sure the jury thought Maxwell practiced voodoo, Radney would ask the state's witnesses about the stories around town. For example, he asked one witness if they knew about how the Reverend smeared blood on porches and hung chickens from pecan trees. Radney also asked if the witness knew about a box of black pepper that was inexplicably found on Maxwell's body after he was killed. The witness had no idea, but that was okay. Radney's questioning was enough to make the jury think the voodoo stories were true. Radney told the jury that Robert did kill Willie Maxwell, but it wasn't premeditated. While he sat with members of Miss Ellington's family at the funeral, he intended to do no criminal act. Robert had been insane at the time of the shooting, and Tom Radney even had a psychologist who agreed to testify to this. Radney told the jury about how Robert was a good man who had come back from Vietnam with what we would now consider PTSD. And it was because of the PTSD that Robert shot and killed Willie Maxwell. One prosecution witness, Robert's niece Patricia, accidentally helped prove her uncle's PTSD with her testimony. She said she had been sitting next to Robert in the second pew of the chapel during Shirley's funeral. Robert had been crying the whole time. He was so emotional he could not speak. Patricia testified that after Robert shot Maxwell the first time, she started screaming at him, but he seemed to be in some kind of trance and wouldn't even look at her. Then, in another win for the defense, one of Willie Maxwell's former employees, Alfonso Murphy, testified that prior to Shirley's death, Maxwell tried to hire him on numerous occasions to kill Shirley. The first time was in early June, when Willie Maxwell asked Alfonso to visit him so they could discuss Alfonso coming back to work for Maxwell. But that was just a ruse. The Reverend wanted to talk to him about killing Shirley. Maxwell told Alfonso that Shirley had tried to poison him, and because of that, he wanted to kill her, but it had to be done before June 16th. After Alfonso said no, a desperate Maxwell offered him a car, money, and an acre of land outfitted with a trailer home. Alfonso still said no. The Reverend kept asking, but Alfonso would not give in. Alfonso did eventually tell his boss, Jimmy Thornton, about Maxwell's harassment. At one point, Willie Maxwell actually showed up at Alfonso's work to try and convince him. Luckily, Jimmy was there that day and ran him off, and then reported him to the police. An officer corroborated Alfonso and Jimmy's statements. Alfonso also testified that prior to Shirley's funeral, he told the Burns family that Willie Maxwell tried to hire him to kill Shirley. They must not have believed him because Willie Maxwell was present at the funeral. After a day and a half of trial, closing statements were through and the jury began deliberations. A few hours in, they wanted to know what would happen to Robert if they found him not guilty by reason of insanity. The judge told them not to worry about that. On September 27th, after deliberating for 5 hours, the jury did find Robert not guilty by reason of insanity. When the jury foreman, L.D. Benton, was later told about the statement Robert made to his brother about killing Maxwell, Benton responded, "I don't think it would have made any difference if the statement had been presented to us." The judge wanted to immediately send Robert to Bryce Hospital for an evaluation, but Tom Radney asked that he get to spend the night with his family. The judge agreed. Following the conviction, District Attorney Tom Young released a statement. Now, a cold-blooded murderer is a hero. The plea of insanity was never proven. In fact, it was completely disproven. He ended the statement with, "Any commitment of Burns to Bryce would be a complete farce and a waste of taxpayers' money. If he is sent over there, he won't need a change of clothes, but he might need to pack a lunch." The next day, the judge ordered Robert committed to Bryce Mental Hospital for evaluation. Staff determined that Robert was not insane at the time of the shooting. Dr. Gunnels, the psychologist who testified at Robert's trial, later said she knew Robert wasn't insane. Dr. Gunnels later told the media, quote, "In a way, killing Willie Maxwell was the sanest thing anybody did all summer. She said Robert was just doing what the law ought to have done sooner. Dr. Gunnels said, 'Why, I probably would have killed that man myself.'" Robert spent a few weeks at Bryce Hospital before he was released as a completely free man. Following Shirley's death, Ophelia Maxwell had the audacity to sue Shirley's life insurance company, seeking $15,000. Although I guess it's not that shocking, considering it is believed she helped Willie Maxwell murder his first wife, Mary Lou. The insurance company refused to pay Ophelia for numerous reasons, not the least of which was that Shirley's signature had been forged. And this is where the saga of the Reverend Willie Maxwell ends. I think the good Reverend thought he was untouchable after getting away with 4 other murders, so he had the gall to show up at Shirley's funeral, not worried about prosecution, and possibly never dreaming that the tables of violence would be turned on him. I do very much believe that the world lost out when Harper Lee did not publish a book on the Reverend's crimes and his murder. She was not just a gifted researcher and writer. She had an innate sense of justice. I think she would have seen it the way author Casey Sepp did. It's a story of black-on-black crime, and she would know how important it was to talk about that. And she was from Alabama. She understood the locals, and she also knew a bit about the culture and history of voodoo. But these were also the problems at the time Lee was researching the book. The black community did not want to talk to the press, maybe not even with a famous author. And as Casey Sepp discovered, those that did wanted to be paid for their story. Harper Lee absolutely would not pay a source. She felt it was unethical and refused to compromise her standards. Lee had volumes of paperwork on Willie Maxwell's crimes, the full paper trail of his insurance fraud, which, by the way, Tom Radney, who would defend Willie's killer, certainly profited from. Radney, who had run for public office a few times, said he had already stated publicly that he would not represent the Reverend for Shirley's murder. And he felt no ethical quandary representing his former client's killer. But Harper Lee was lacking the emotion of getting to know the victims of Willie Maxwell, something that would have been essential to the story. And that is something I can certainly identify with. I have shut down episodes that do not have enough background information on the victims. I need to feel emotionally connected, and it is very difficult in this case. Mary Lou Maxwell, John Columbus, Dorcas Anderson Maxwell, James Hicks, Shirley Ellington. These people were his family, 2 of his wives, and his own brother and nephew, his own blood, and finally, his stepdaughter. They don't just make Willie Maxwell a serial killer, they make him a monster. The so-called Reverend may not have practiced voodoo, but he was no man of God. He was a cold-blooded killer, and his chickens came home to roost. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was written and researched by myself and Haley Gray. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Thank you to everyone who suggested this case, with a special thanks to Colleen Wade, and my condolences to you on the loss of your dad. I'm so sorry he didn't get to hear this episode. I would like to dedicate this episode to Colleen's dad and my own dad. You're just never really old enough to lose your daddy. I do very much recommend Casey Sepp's book, Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee. She goes as far as she possibly could into the Maxwell murders, aided by Lee's own research materials. But she also takes a look at Tom Radney and the politics of that era before ending the final third of the book with a biography of Harper Lee. It's fantastic. If you have any case suggestions, please visit my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, and go to the listener suggestion tab. And if you have submitted a case suggestion in the last few months, please resubmit it on the website. This is the best way for me to get to those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember, I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. With 3 platforms to manage, that is very overwhelming for me. I hope you understand. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime. Not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe, and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Stitcher, and Spotify. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.